All right, let's dive into this.
Sounds good.
Today, it's all about boundaries.
Right.
We've got some excerpts here from Boundaries: When to Say Yes, How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life
Okay.
by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And
Oh,
just from reading these excerpts, this is
yeah,
a really interesting book.
it is.
So we're going to explore
Right.
what boundaries are, why they matter,
Yeah.
how we develop them, and how we can set better boundaries. And
Yeah.
I think there are some really interesting stories in here
Yeah.
that will help us kind of unpack this in a way that's really relatable.
Absolutely. And what I think is so cool about this book is that it takes this kind of complex idea
Yeah.
and makes it very approachable.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways they do that is they use this analogy of boundaries being like our personal property lines.
Okay, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So break that down for me, because I think that's a really good way to picture.
Absolutely. So just imagine your home.
Yeah.
You have a fence or, a property line that separates your space from your neighbors.
Right.
Boundaries are kind of like that.
Yeah.
For our lives, they define where you end
Yeah.
and someone else begins.
Okay.
They protect your time, your energy, your feelings, your values,
Mm-hmm.
even your physical space.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about having ownership over yourself,
Right.
which ultimately leads to feeling good mentally and emotionally.
That makes total sense. But we don't just like pop out of the womb with these
Okay.
perfectly defined boundaries, right?
Exactly. And the book really emphasizes how boundaries are learned.
Okay.
It's not something that we're just born with.
Okay.
And a lot of this learning happens in childhood
Yeah.
through our interactions with our parents.
So are they saying, like, if you had parents who weren't good at boundaries, you're
Well,
doomed?
Not necessarily doomed, but it definitely makes things trickier.
Yeah.
The book breaks down some key stages of boundary development.
Okay.
They talk about hatching, which is that initial realization
Uh-huh.
as a baby that you are separate
Yeah.
from your mom.
Mhm.
And then there's the practicing phase,
Okay.
which, we see with little kids.
Yes.
They're pushing limits and testing boundaries to see what they can get away with.
Oh, yeah.
It's like the terrible twos.
That's like my life right now.
Right.
5-year-old.
Exactly. But here's the thing about that no stage.
Yeah.
It's actually super important
Okay.
because it leads to the next stage, which they call rapprochement.
Okay.
That's where kids start to understand that no has power.
Uh-huh.
It means they have a voice and they have a right to assert themselves.
Right.
So even though it can be frustrating as parents,
For sure.
that no is actually a sign of healthy development.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about when things go wrong in those early stages.
Yeah.
Because not everyone has parents who are like boundary setting ninjas.
Right.
What kind of problems can that lead to later on?
Yeah, they talk about two main types of boundary problems. You have what they call compliant people.
Okay.
These are the people that struggle to say no.
Oh.
They fear loss of love or making others angry if they set limits.
Right. So they're people pleasers.
Exactly.
Okay.
And on the flip side, you have what they call controllers,
Okay.
who basically bulldoze over other people's boundaries
Oh, yeah.
because they need to manipulate or guilt people into getting their way.
So you're either a doormat or a
Right.
bulldozer.
Yeah, those are the two extremes.
Okay.
And it's not always that black and white,
Yeah.
but it is interesting how both of these patterns often stem from those early childhood experiences.
So give me an example. How could your childhood lead to you being
Oh.
either one of these extremes?
So if you grew up in a home where you were constantly criticized or controlled,
Yeah.
you might become overly compliant as an adult,
Okay.
always trying to please others to avoid conflict.
God. What about controllers?
They often have this deep-seated fear of vulnerability. So they might have experienced some sort of trauma or neglect in their past.
Okay.
So they build up these walls and develop controlling behaviors as a way to protect themselves.
Okay.
And they struggle to take responsibility for their own emotions and needs,
Right.
so they try to control everyone else around them.
That's actually pretty sad when you think about it.
It is.
It's not just that they're being jerks. They're
Yeah.
coming from a place of hurt.
Absolutely. And it doesn't excuse their behavior, of course,
Right.
but it helps to understand where it's coming from.
So let's say somebody's listening to this right now
Uh.
and they're like, oh, shoot, I might have some boundary issues.
Uh-huh.
What's the next step? Does the book just leave you hanging with that realization?
No, not at all.
Mm.
That's where the 10 laws of boundaries come in.
Okay.
These are basically the guiding principles for setting healthy boundaries.
Give me a sneak peek at a couple of these laws because we've got a lot to unpack.
Absolutely. One that stood out to me was the law of sowing and reaping, which basically says that we reap what we sow even when it comes to boundaries.
Okay.
So if you constantly let people walk all over you,
Yeah.
you're going to keep attracting people who will take advantage of you.
Right. Makes sense.
But if you start setting limits and confronting bad behavior,
Yeah.
you will eventually attract people who respect you and your boundaries.
So there's hope for us boundary challenged folks.
Exactly.
It's not like we're
Yeah.
stuck with this forever.
No.
Okay, good.
Another one that I love is the law of responsibility.
Okay.
And this one emphasizes that you are responsible for yourself, but responsible to love others.
Mm.
And sometimes setting boundaries is the most loving thing you can do.
Wait, how can setting boundaries be loving? That sounds counterintuitive.
So think about it this way. If you're constantly enabling someone's bad behavior by not setting limits, you're not really helping them.
Yeah.
You're actually enabling them to continue down a destructive path.
Right.
But when you set a boundary, you're forcing them to confront their actions and hopefully make better choices.
So it's not about being mean.
Right.
It's about...
Helping them, ultimately.
Exactly.
Right.
And there are 8 more laws
Okay.
that we'll get to unpack.
Awesome.
They cover everything from motivation to communication to even the spiritual aspect of boundaries.
Okay, I am intrigued.
It's fascinating.
Let's take a quick break and we'll come back and unpack even more of these boundary-boosting strategies.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've talked about how boundaries are like those property lines, defining our personal space, and how a lot of our boundary patterns stem from childhood.
Right.
We've also gotten a sneak peek at those 10 laws of boundaries.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned something about the spiritual side of boundaries.
Yes.
And that really piqued my curiosity.
Okay.
What did the book have to say about that?
Well, it's actually really profound.
Okay.
The book talks about how God himself has boundaries.
Okay.
He defines himself as distinct and separate. And he takes full responsibility for his own thoughts, feelings, and actions.
And we are made in his image.
Right.
So it makes sense that we would also need boundaries to live a healthy and fulfilling life.
So if God has boundaries, are they saying that setting boundaries is actually a way of reflecting his nature?
That's exactly what they're suggesting.
Interesting.
It's not just about practical strategies.
Uh-huh.
It's about understanding how boundaries can actually bring us closer to God and help us live in a way that honors him.
Okay, I think for a lot of people, the idea of boundaries still feels kind of negative.
Yeah.
Like it's about shutting people out or being selfish.
Right.
How does the book address that?
Yeah, well, they challenge that misconception head on.
Okay.
The book actually argues that boundaries are essential for true love and connection. It's not about building walls. It's about creating a safe and healthy space for relationships to thrive.
So it's more like setting up a fence, not a fortress.
Think about it. If you don't have any boundaries, you're constantly letting people walk all over you. And then you end up feeling resentful, burned out, unable to truly give to others.
Right.
But when you have healthy boundaries, you're able to show up as your authentic self.
Yeah.
You can give freely without feeling depleted.
Right.
And your relationships are based on mutual respect and love.
Okay. That's starting to click for me.
Good.
How do you actually put this into practice?
Yeah.
It's one thing to understand the concept, but it's another to actually do it.
Absolutely. And that's where those 10 laws come in handy.
Okay.
One that we haven't touched on yet is the law of exposure.
Okay.
And this one emphasizes the importance of clear communication.
So no more dropping hints or hoping people will just magically figure it out?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The book says that if we don't communicate our boundaries directly, they will inevitably come out in unhealthy ways.
Okay.
Like passive aggressiveness, resentment, or even manipulation.
Oh, that's not good.
Oh.
So how do we get better at this whole communicating our boundaries thing?
Well, the book really stresses that it's not just what you say, but how you say it. It's about speaking the truth in love. You can be firm and assertive without being harsh or aggressive.
Right.
And sometimes setting boundaries means having those tough conversations, even if it feels uncomfortable in the moment.
And I think a lot of people struggle with that, especially when it comes to family.
Oh, yeah.
There's this sense of obligation, like you're supposed to always say yes to your loved ones.
Yes.
Even if it's detrimental to your well-being.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the book debunks this myth that saying no to family means that you're being unloving.
Okay.
In fact, it argues that sometimes setting boundaries is actually an act of obedience to God.
Obedience. Hold on. How does that tie in?
The book points out that God designed us to be responsible for our own lives. We're called to steward our time, energy, and resources wisely.
Right.
So when we are constantly overextending ourselves and neglecting our own needs to please others,
Yeah.
we're actually being disobedient to God's design.
Wow, I never thought about it that way before.
Yeah,
But it makes sense, like we're putting other people's expectations up above God's will for our lives.
exactly. And it's not about becoming cold or distant from our families.
Right.
It's about setting those healthy boundaries so
Mhm.
that we can love them well
Uh-huh.
and take care of ourselves in the process.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks here.
Okay.
The book talks about setting boundaries in different areas of life.
Right.
Give me some examples of how this might play out in friendships.
Okay, so let's say you have that friend who always seems to be in crisis.
Oh, yeah, I know that friend.
Right. And they constantly need rescuing.
Yes.
So it might be tempting to always drop everything to help.
Right.
But the book encourages us to ask ourselves, is this really helping them in the long run?
Okay.
If you're constantly enabling their dependence, you're not allowing them to develop the skills.
Right.
They need to cope with life's challenges on their own.
Yeah.
So setting a boundary in this case might mean saying something like, hey, I care about you, but I can't always be available to solve your problems.
Yeah.
I'm happy to listen and offer support. But ultimately, you need to take responsibility for your own choices.
That's tough love,
Yep.
but it's
Yeah.
so true.
Yeah.
I've definitely been in friendships where I felt like I was more of a therapist than a friend.
Right.
What about romantic relationships? How do boundaries come into play there?
Yeah, one big one is around expectations and needs.
Okay.
So the book emphasizes that even though you're in a relationship, you're still two separate individuals
Right.
with your own unique needs and desires.
Yeah.
So it's important to communicate those clearly
Okay.
and respect each other's boundaries, even if they are different.
So it's okay to say, hey, I need some alone time tonight, or I'm not comfortable with that level of physical intimacy,
Yes,
without feeling guilty or like you're rejecting your partner.
absolutely. It's all about honesty and open communication.
Right.
And if your partner isn't respecting your boundaries, that's a red flag.
Yeah. That's a whole other issue.
Exactly.
You know, I think one area where a lot of people struggle with boundaries is at work.
Oh, for sure.
It's so easy to get caught up in that always-on mentality
Yes.
and feel like you have to say yes to every demand,
Huh.
even if it means sacrificing your personal time and well-being.
That's a huge issue these days, especially with technology, making it harder to disconnect.
Right.
But the book offers some really practical tips
Okay.
for setting boundaries in the workplace.
Like what?
Things like setting clear expectations with your boss, learning to delegate tasks, and prioritizing your time effectively.
So it's about being proactive and taking control of your workload
Yes,
instead of letting it control you.
exactly. And it's also about recognizing your limits
Yeah.
and knowing when to say no
Okay.
to those unreasonable demands.
Right.
It's about protecting your time and energy
Right.
so that you can be your best self, both at work and in your personal life.
As we're talking about all these different areas of life,
Yeah,
it's really hitting me that setting boundaries is not a one-time thing.
right.
This is an ongoing process.
Absolutely. It's a journey, not a destination.
Right.
And the book encourages us to be patient with ourselves and others.
Yeah.
As we navigate this process, it's not about being perfect. It's about making progress
Right.
and constantly striving to create healthier relationships with ourselves and others.
That's a good reminder.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this part. We've talked about the spiritual dimension of boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
the importance of communication, and how these principles apply in various relationships.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm already starting to see things in a new light.
Me too, but we're not done yet.
Oh, there's more.
In the next part, we'll delve into some more practical tips and strategies
Okay.
for actually implementing these boundary-boosting principles in your everyday life.
All right, I'm ready. Let's take another deep dive. All right, I'm ready for more.
Okay.
I feel like we've made some good progress so far.
Yeah.
We've explored how boundaries are like those property lines, the importance of communicating them effectively,
Uh-huh.
and how they reflect God's design.
Yes.
Now I want to get even more practical. What are some specific things people can do
Yeah.
to start setting healthier boundaries?
One key principle the book highlights is taking ownership of our own feelings. We often fall into the trap of thinking
Yeah.
other people are responsible for how we feel.
Oh, I'm so guilty of that.
Right.
If someone's in a bad mood,
Yeah.
I automatically assume it's because of something I did.
That's a common one.
Yeah.
But the book reminds us that we always have a choice
Okay.
in how we respond to situations and other people's behavior.
Right.
We can't control what others do, but we can control how we react.
So instead of saying, you made me feel this way,
Yeah.
it's more about saying, I'm feeling this way because of how I'm choosing to interpret this situation.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's about empowering yourself to take responsibility for your own emotions.
Right.
Which is a huge step in setting healthy boundaries.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those times when someone is genuinely treating you poorly? Are you saying we should just suck it up and pretend it doesn't bother us?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Setting boundaries doesn't mean expressing your feelings or becoming a doormat.
Okay.
It's about recognizing your limits and communicating them clearly.
So, for example, let's say you have that friend who's constantly borrowing money,
Okay.
but never pays it back.
Yeah.
How would you approach that situation with this whole owning your feelings thing in mind?
Okay, so instead of stewing in resentment or getting angry, you could say something like, hey, I value our friendship, but when you borrow money and don't repay it,
Right.
it makes me feel disrespected and taken advantage of.
Okay.
I'm happy to help you out in other ways.
Yeah.
But I'm not comfortable lending you money anymore.
Wow, that's direct.
Right.
But it's also really kind and respectful.
It is.
I think a lot of people are afraid to have those tough conversations.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to hurt the other person's feelings.
I get that. It's definitely uncomfortable. But the book reminds us that sometimes those uncomfortable conversations are necessary
Okay.
to protect ourselves and maintain healthy relationships. And often it leads to greater respect and understanding in the long run.
So it's not about being mean or cutting people off. It's about setting those clear limits.
Right.
So that the relationship can actually thrive.
Exactly. The book also emphasizes that boundaries are a form of self-care. It's not selfish to prioritize your own well-being.
Right.
In fact, it's essential if you want to show up fully for others.
I think a lot of people struggle with that, especially women.
Uh-huh.
We're often conditioned to put everyone else's needs before our own.
It's true. But the book challenges that notion
Okay.
and reminds us that taking care of ourselves is not a luxury. It's a necessity.
What about those internal boundaries?
Oh, yeah.
What about like overspending or procrastination?
No.
How do boundaries apply there?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
The book addresses those internal struggles as well.
Okay.
Talks about setting boundaries with ourselves, which can be even harder than setting them with others.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
My to-do list is a mile long, and I cannot resist the siren call of social media.
It's all about developing that self-discipline muscle,
Okay.
which takes time and practice.
Right.
The book suggests identifying your triggers, setting realistic goals,
Yeah.
and holding yourself accountable.
So maybe instead of saying, I'm never going on social media again,
Right.
which is totally unrealistic,
Exactly.
I could say, okay, I'm going to allow myself 30 minutes of social media time per day.
Yeah.
And then I'm putting my phone away.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance and creating those healthy habits
Okay.
that support your overall well-being.
You know, I think one of the most comforting things about this book is its emphasis on grace.
Oh, for sure.
It acknowledges that we're all human. We're going to mess up.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Exactly. It's not about being perfect.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're all on a journey and we're constantly learning and growing.
So if someone's listening to this and they're feeling a bit overwhelmed, like they have a million boundaries they need to set,
Yeah.
what's the best way to approach this?
Start small. Pick one area of your life
Right.
where you feel like your boundaries are weakest and focus on setting one clear boundary in that area. It could be as simple as saying no to one extra commitment
Right.
or having a conversation with a friend about a behavior that's been bothering you.
Okay, and remember, this is a process.
Yes.
It takes time to unlearn those old patterns and develop new, healthier habits.
It does.
But it's so worth it.
It is. As you start setting those boundaries, you'll be amazed
Yeah.
at the positive impact it has on your life and relationships.
Right.
You'll feel more empowered, more confident, and more at peace.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of boundaries.
It has been.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of what boundaries are and why they're so important.
Yeah.
It's not about being selfish or controlling. It's about taking care of ourselves and creating healthy, loving relationships.
Right.
And remember, if you're struggling with this, you don't have to do it alone.
Absolutely.
Reach out to a trusted friend, a therapist, a counselor for support.
Yes.
There's no shame in seeking help.
No, not at all.
We encourage you to continue exploring this topic.
Yeah.
Maybe even pick up the full book, Boundaries. When to say yes, how to say no to take control of your life.
Absolutely.
It's packed with even more wisdom and practical advice.
And most importantly, be kind to yourself.
Yes.
As you navigate this journey, celebrate your progress, learn from your mistakes,
Right.
and keep moving forward.
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep diving deep
Yes.
and keep discovering the power of setting healthy boundaries.